What does it feel like to leave Earth for the first time? Not in imagination, not in a movie, but in real life. To sit inside a small capsule of metal and fire, knowing that in a few heartbeats, gravity will loosen its hold and the world you've always known will fall away beneath you. We tend to think of space exploration as loud, roaring rockets, flashing headlines, dramatic countdowns, but that isn't where the real story lives. The real story lives in the quiet moments, a gloved hand hovering over a switch, a signal traveling through empty space, a human voice echoing across the void saying calmly, "We're here." Tonight, you'll gently travel through the 101 facts about space exploration, from the first fragile satellites to footsteps on the moon, from robotic explorers drifting past distant planets to telescopes unfolding in deep orbit. You won't need to memorize dates or technical details. Instead, you'll understand what happened, why it mattered, and how it slowly changed our place in the universe. So pull the covers a little closer, let the day grow distant. Because we are about to retrace the quiet, astonishing path of how a small blue planet learned to reach into the dark. The first human-made object to ever reach space was not a gleaming spacecraft. It was not built with exploration in mind. It was a German V2 rocket launched in June of 1944 during the darkest chapter of a world at war. The rocket rose on a pillar of flame, climbing higher and higher until it crossed an invisible line 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, a boundary we now call the Kármán line, the place where our atmosphere thins into nearly nothing, where the blue sky fades into the black stillness of space. The V2 was a weapon, born from suffering and built for destruction, and yet, in that single moment of ascent, it accidentally became the first thing made by human hands to touch the edge of the cosmos. It is a strange and complicated beginning to our story, that the first whisper we sent to the heavens came not from wonder, but from war. And still, the sky received it. The sky always receives what rises toward it, no matter where it came from, no matter why it was sent. That invisible line at 100 kilometers did not care about the intention behind the rocket. It simply opened, the way a door opens, and let something through for the very first time. That invisible boundary the V2 crossed has a name, and it is called the Kármán line. It sits exactly 100 kilometers, about 62 miles, above the surface of the Earth, and it is the place where scientists and dreamers alike have agreed that the sky ends and space begins. Below it, there is still enough air to carry sound, to hold a bird aloft, to scatter sunlight into blue. Above it, the air becomes so thin that it can no longer support flight, and the rules change. Everything changes. The Kármán line is not a wall, not a visible border painted across the heavens. It is more like a veil, thin and silent, and on one side of it is everything you have ever known, wind and weather and the weight of gravity pulling you close, and on the other side is the universe, vast and still and waiting. Every astronaut who has ever floated in orbit, every satellite that beams your favorite song back to Earth, every telescope peering into the deep past of the cosmos, all of them had to cross that quiet veil first. 100 kilometers. It sounds so close. And in a way, it is. Space is closer to you right now than many cities you could drive to. It is just above you, always, separated only by a thin breath of sky. Before any person dared to ride a rocket into the unknown, we sent smaller, braver travelers first. In 1947, a group of tiny fruit flies, creatures so small you could hold a dozen in the palm of your hand, were sealed inside a capsule and placed aboard an American V2 rocket. The rocket launched from the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, carrying those impossibly small passengers upward, past the clouds, past the thin blue edge of the atmosphere, and into the silence of space. The fruit flies crossed the Kármán line and then returned, parachuting back to Earth in their little capsule, alive and unharmed. They became the first living creatures from our world to journey into space and come home again. It is a gentle thought, is it not? That our first ambassadors to the cosmos were not soldiers or scientists, but a handful of insects no bigger than a grain of rice, drifting in the dark for a few quiet minutes, not knowing that they had just made history. They did not understand where they had been. They could not tell us what they saw, but they came back breathing, And that was enough. That was the tiny, whispered proof that life could survive the crossing. On the evening of October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union changed the world without firing a single shot. They launched Sputnik 1, a small, polished metal sphere, into orbit around the Earth. And in doing so, they placed the first artificial satellite into the sky. Sputnik traveled at nearly 18,000 miles per hour, circling the planet once every 96 minutes, and as it passed overhead, it sent a signal back to the ground, a simple rhythmic beep, 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 like the heartbeat of something newborn. People all over the world tuned their radios and listened. They stood in their backyards and looked up, trying to spot the tiny glint of reflected sunlight as it sailed across the stars. It was not a complicated machine. It carried no cameras, no instruments of great sophistication. It simply orbited and beeped and proved that a thing made by human hands could circle the Earth the way the moon does, the way the planets circle the sun. That beeping sound, that small, steady pulse from above, changed everything. It was the sound of a new age beginning, a new chapter in the oldest story we know, the story of looking up and wanting to go. For all the awe it inspired, Sputnik 1 was a remarkably small and simple thing. It measured just 58 centimeters across, roughly the size of a beach ball you might toss around on a warm summer afternoon. And it weighed about 83 kilograms, no heavier than a grown person. Its body was a smooth, polished aluminum sphere with 4 long, slender antennas trailing behind it like the legs of some gentle silver spider drifting through the dark. Inside, there was a radio transmitter and a set of batteries, and not much else. It had no way to steer, no way to take photographs, no way to do anything but orbit and send its signal. And yet, this little sphere, this beach ball-sized whisper of metal, shook the entire world. Governments scrambled, scientists marveled, ordinary people stared at the night sky with a new kind of wonder, because it was not the size of the thing that mattered. It was the fact that it was there at all, a small, brave object circling the Earth in the silence of space, proving that the boundary between our world and the cosmos was not as far away or as impossible to cross as we had always believed. Not long after Sputnik 1 fell silent, the Soviet Union sent something else into orbit, something with a heartbeat. In November of 1957, a small dog named Laika was placed inside the capsule of Sputnik 2 and launched into the sky. Laika was a stray, found wandering the cold streets of Moscow, and she became the first animal to orbit the Earth. She was chosen because she was calm, because she was resilient, because she had already survived so much in her short life on the ground. Scientists fitted her with a padded harness and sensors to monitor her breathing and her heart, and then they let the rocket carry her up, past the clouds, past the thin blue veil, and into the wide black silence above. Laika did not come home. The technology to bring her safely back did not yet exist, and she passed away in orbit, alone and far from the streets where she had once wandered free. Her story is not an easy one to hold. It is threaded with both wonder and sorrow, the way so many of our earliest steps into space were. But she flew. She orbited the Earth, a small and trusting creature cradled inside a machine, circling the planet in the dark, her heartbeat recorded and sent back to the ground like a lullaby no one had asked for, but everyone needed to hear. On April 12, 1961, a young man from a small village in Russia climbed into a tiny capsule called Vostok 1 and became the first human being to travel into space. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and he was only 27 years old. The rocket beneath him roared to life, shaking the ground, pushing him upward through the atmosphere with a force that pressed him deep into his seat. And then, as the sky outside his window turned from blue to black, everything grew quiet. He was in space. He was floating above the Earth, looking down at the planet in a way no person had ever seen it before, whole and blue and impossibly beautiful, wrapped in a thin glow of atmosphere like a candle flame. Gagarin orbited the Earth once, a single great circle around the world, and during that orbit he is said to have whispered in wonder and awe that the Earth was blue and that it was beautiful. It was not a complicated observation. It was not scientific language. It was simply a man alone in the dark, looking down at his home and feeling the full, overwhelming tenderness of what he saw. The first human voice in space did not shout or command or declare, it simply marveled. The entirety of Yuri Gagarin's historic journey, from the moment the rocket left the ground to the moment he landed safely back on Earth, lasted only 108 minutes. That is less than 2 hours. Less than the length of most movies you might watch on a quiet evening. In that slender window of time, a human being left the Earth, circled the entire planet, and returned. 108 minutes to change the course of history. 108 minutes to prove that a person could survive the shaking violence of launch, the silence of weightlessness, the searing heat of re-entry, and come home alive. It is remarkable when you hold that number in your mind how small a container of time it was for something so enormous. Gagarin ate no meals in space. He did not sleep. He barely had time to watch a full sunrise before the capsule was already angling back toward the atmosphere. And yet, those 108 minutes contained more firsts, more newness, more sheer human daring than perhaps any other hour and 48 minutes in the history of our species. A blink of time, and everything was different. Less than a month after Gagarin's flight, the United States sent its own astronaut into the sky. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard climbed aboard a small Mercury capsule named Freedom 7 and launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida. His flight was shorter and simpler than Gagarin's, a suborbital arc that rose up into space and then came back down, lasting only about 15 minutes from start to finish. He did not orbit the Earth. He did not circle the planet or watch a sunrise from above. He simply went up, tasted the silence of space for a few brief moments, and came back. But those 15 minutes mattered enormously. They were America's first breath of space, the first proof that the United States too could send a person beyond the sky and bring them home safely. Shepard felt the press of acceleration, saw the curve of the Earth through his small window, and experienced a few precious minutes of weightlessness before gravity pulled him back. 15 minutes, a quarter of an hour, barely enough time to drink a cup of tea, and yet it was enough to plant a flag in the history of human spaceflight, enough to say, we are here too, we are reaching too, and we will not stop. On February 20th, 1962, astronaut John Glenn climbed into a Mercury capsule called Friendship 7 and became the first American to orbit the Earth. 3 times he circled the planet, watching through his tiny window as continents and oceans slid past beneath him, lit by the sun, and then plunged into the shadow of night and then lit again. Each orbit took roughly 90 minutes, and during those loops around the world, Glenn saw things no American had ever seen from such a vantage. The thin, glowing line of the atmosphere hugging the curve of the Earth, the impossibly bright stars undimmed by any sky, the slow dance of day and night as the planet turned beneath him. He described seeing tiny luminous particles floating outside his window, glowing like fireflies in the dark, a mystery that enchanted the public and that scientists later determined were likely frost flakes drifting from the outside of his spacecraft, catching the sunlight and shimmering like living things. Glenn's flight lasted just under 5 hours, but its impact rippled outward for decades. He became a national hero, a symbol of calm courage and proof that Americans could not only reach space, but stay there, circling the world in a kind of graceful orbital waltz. On June 16, 1963, a young woman named Valentina Tereshkova boarded a spacecraft called Vostok 6 and launched into orbit, becoming the first woman to travel into space. She was not a trained pilot or a career scientist. She was a textile factory worker and an amateur parachutist, chosen from among hundreds of candidates for her calm temperament, her physical fitness, and her remarkable composure under pressure. The rocket carried her upward, through the atmosphere and into the black silence beyond, and there she was, floating above the Earth, looking down at the same blue world that Gagarin had marveled at 2 years before, but seeing it now with her own eyes, through her own window, with her own beating heart. Tereshkova spent nearly 3 days in space, longer than all the American astronauts before her had spent combined at that point. She was alone in her capsule, alone in orbit, a single human being circling the Earth again and again while the world below turned and slept and woke and turned again. Her call sign was Chaika, the Russian word for seagull, and there is something lovely in that, something fitting. a bird's name for the first woman to fly higher than any bird had ever flown. During her nearly 3 days aboard Vostok 6, Valentina Tereshkova completed just over 47 orbits around the Earth, 47.1 to be precise. Imagine that for a moment. 47 times she watched the sun rise over the curved edge of the planet. 47 times she saw the light slip away as her capsule sailed into the shadow of the Earth, the land below going dark, the cities becoming tiny constellations of their own. Each orbit took about 88 minutes, and each one carried her over oceans and deserts and mountain ranges and sleeping towns, over places she had never been and would never visit on foot. 47 loops of the world, alone in a small metal vessel, with nothing but the hum of instruments and the slow turning of the planet to keep her company. It is a deeply quiet thing to picture. One woman, circling and circling, the Earth repeating itself beneath her like a song with endless verses, each pass revealing the same beautiful world from a slightly different angle, a slightly different light. When she finally returned to the ground, parachuting down into the fields of Kazakhstan, she had traveled farther than almost any human being alive, and she had done it gently, orbit by orbit, like a seagull tracing wide, patient circles above the sea. On March 18, 1965, a Soviet cosmonaut named Alexei Leonov did something no human being had ever done before. He opened the hatch of his Voskhod 2 spacecraft, pushed himself out through the airlock, and floated into the open void of space. For approximately 12 minutes, Leonov drifted outside the capsule tethered by a slender cord with nothing between his body and the vacuum of the universe but the thin layers of his spacesuit. Below him, the Earth stretched out in impossible detail. Blue oceans, white clouds, the brown and green patchwork of continents turning slowly in the sunlight. Above him, the stars. Around him, silence. Leonov later described the experience as overwhelming, a sensory fullness unlike anything he had imagined. But the spacewalk was not without danger. His suit inflated in the vacuum, ballooning outward until he could barely bend his arms or legs, and he struggled to get back inside the airlock. He had to partially depressurize his own suit, a terrifying risk, just to fit through the hatch. But he made it. He pulled himself back inside, sealed the door, and breathed. 12 minutes. The first 12 minutes a human being had ever spent floating free in the cosmos, held by nothing but a cord and a prayer. Just a few months after Leonov's harrowing float above the Earth, American astronaut Ed White stepped outside his own spacecraft and into the void. On June 3, 1965, during the Gemini 4 mission, White opened the hatch of his capsule and pushed himself out into space, becoming the first American to perform a spacewalk. He carried a small handheld maneuvering unit, a device that released bursts of pressurized gas to help him move, and for about 20 minutes, he floated and tumbled above the Earth, connected to the spacecraft by a golden tether and an umbilical line that fed him oxygen. White later said that the spacewalk was the most comfortable part of the entire mission, and that the hardest moment was when he was told it was time to come back inside. He did not want to return. Out there, floating above the blue curve of the world, with the sun blazing against his visor and the darkness of space stretching endlessly in every direction, he had found something that words could not quite hold. A freedom, a stillness, a kind of beauty that made the inside of the capsule feel small by comparison. He came back in, of course. He sealed the hatch and returned to his seat. But something in him, you can imagine, never quite came all the way back inside. On May 25, 1961, just 20 days after Alan Shepard's brief 15-minute flight, President John F. Kennedy stood before the United States Congress and declared a goal so bold it almost seemed reckless. He said that before the decade was over, America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. At the time, the United States had barely dipped its toes into space. No American had even orbited the planet yet. The total amount of time an American had spent in space was measured in minutes, not hours, and the technology needed to reach the moon did not yet exist. And yet Kennedy spoke with calm conviction, as though he were describing something inevitable rather than something nearly impossible. His words became a kind of gravitational pull of their own, bending the trajectory of an entire nation toward a single luminous point in the night sky. The moon, which had hung silently above humanity for all of recorded history, a lantern, a mystery, a lullaby, was suddenly a destination. Somewhere to go, somewhere to land, and a country that had barely learned to fly beyond the atmosphere was now promising to walk upon another world within the span of a single decade. The Apollo program, which would carry humans to the moon, ran from 1961 to 1972 and included a total of 17 missions. Not all of them flew to the moon. The early Apollo missions were tests, careful, methodical rehearsals in which engineers and astronauts slowly proved that each piece of the enormous puzzle could work. They tested the spacecraft in Earth orbit. They tested the engines, the docking systems, the life support, the heat shields. They practiced maneuvers that had never been attempted and solved problems that had never existed before. Each mission built upon the last like chapters in a long and patient story, each one bringing humanity a little closer to the moment when a human being would actually set foot on the lunar surface. The program was vast, employing over 400,000 people at its peak, drawing on the work of universities and factories and laboratories across the country. It was one of the largest coordinated efforts in human history, and it was all aimed at a single, quiet destination. That pale circle of light in the night sky, waiting, as it always had, in silence. In December of 1968, the crew of Apollo 8 became the first human beings to leave Earth orbit and travel to the moon. They did not land. That was not yet the plan. Instead, astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders rode their spacecraft on a 3-day journey across the void, entered orbit around the moon, circled it 10 times, and then came home. It was the first time any human being had ever seen the far side of the moon with their own eyes. It was the first time anyone had traveled so far from home that the Earth became small enough to cover with an outstretched thumb. For those hours in lunar orbit, the 3 men looked down at a barren, cratered world, grey and silent and ancient beyond imagining. And they looked back at the Earth, hanging in the blackness like a jewel, and something shifted inside them, and inside everyone who watched. To see the Earth from the moon, small, whole, radiant with blue, was to understand, perhaps for the first time, how precious and how fragile our home truly is. Apollo 8 did not touch the moon, but it touched something deeper. During that Apollo 8 mission, as the spacecraft came around from behind the moon on one of its orbits, astronaut William Anders looked out his window and saw something that took his breath away. The Earth was rising above the lunar horizon, a brilliant blue and white sphere emerging from behind the grey, lifeless edge of the moon, glowing with colour and life against the absolute blackness of space. Anders grabbed his camera and took a photograph, and that image, known simply as Earthrise, became one of the most famous and most important photographs in human history. It showed our planet as no one had ever seen it before, small, alone, floating in an immense darkness, wrapped in swirls of cloud and ocean, heartbreakingly beautiful. There were no borders visible, no lines between nations, no evidence of war or politics or division, just a single, luminous world, alive and shining in the void. The photograph changed the way humanity thought about itself. It helped spark the environmental movement, inspired a generation of scientists and poets and dreamers, and reminded every person who saw it that we are all, every one of us, passengers on the same small, exquisite ship sailing through the dark together. On July 20th, 1969, 2 astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin, guided a small, fragile-looking spacecraft called the Eagle down through the silent sky above the moon and landed on its surface. It was the first time in all of human history that people from Earth had touched another world. Armstrong stepped out first, climbing carefully down the ladder of the lunar module, his boots pressing into the fine, powdery dust of the moon. Dust that had lain undisturbed for billions of years, never touched by wind or rain or any living thing. He spoke words that travelled across the void at the speed of light and into the ears and hearts of hundreds of millions of people listening back on Earth. Aldrin followed him down minutes later, and together they walked, slowly and carefully, across a landscape that was utterly alien. No air, no sound, no color but shades of grey, the sky above them black even though the sun was shining. They planted a flag, they collected rocks, they left footprints that are still there today, perfectly preserved in the ancient dust, because on the moon there is no wind to erase them. Nothing changes there. The footprints will remain for millions of years, quiet testaments to the afternoon two human beings walked upon another world. When Neil Armstrong placed his foot on the surface of the moon, an estimated 600 million people on Earth were watching. 600 million, a number so large it is almost impossible to feel. Families gathered around television sets in living rooms and kitchens and bars and town squares across the world, all of them staring at the same grainy, flickering black and white image. A figure in a white suit, descending a ladder, stepping onto a world that was not our own. It was the middle of the night in some countries, the middle of the afternoon in others, and it did not matter. People stayed awake or paused their day or stood together in the streets, united by a single moment in a way that perhaps no moment before or since has managed. For those few minutes, there were no borders, there were no enemies. There was only this, a human being standing on the moon, and the rest of humanity watching, breathless, from 240,000 miles away. It is one of the rare moments in our history when the whole world held its breath at the same time, when the whole world felt the same thing at the same time. A quiet, overwhelming awe that rose up from somewhere deep and ancient and wordless inside us all. The place where the Eagle landed, where Armstrong and Aldrin took their first steps, was a broad, flat plain on the moon's near side called the Sea of Tranquility. It is not a sea at all, of course. There is no water on the surface of the moon, no waves, no tide, no gentle lapping against a shore. The name comes from an older time, when astronomers peering through early telescopes saw the moon's dark, smooth plains and imagined them to be bodies of water. They gave them beautiful, poetic names: the Sea of Tranquility, the Sea of Serenity, the Ocean of Storms. In truth, these seas are vast expanses of ancient volcanic rock, cooled and hardened billions of years ago, their surfaces now coated in a fine layer of dust called regolith. But the name still fits in its own way. The Sea of Tranquility is tranquil. It is one of the quietest places any human being has ever stood. No wind, no birdsong, no rustle of leaves, no distant hum of traffic. Only silence, pure and complete, stretching in every direction beneath a black sky full of stars. It was here, in this immense and perfect stillness, that humanity first walked on another world. Shortly after the Eagle landed on the moon, and before he stepped outside onto the surface, Buzz Aldrin did something deeply personal and almost entirely private. He conducted a small communion ceremony inside the lunar module. He had brought with him a tiny chalice, a small portion of bread, and a vial of wine, elements of the Christian sacrament. And there, in the silence of the Sea of Tranquility, 240,000 miles from the nearest church, he poured the wine and watched it curl slowly in the gentle gravity of the moon, 1/6 the pull of Earth. He ate the bread. He drank the wine. He read a passage of scripture to himself, quietly, while Armstrong waited nearby. The ceremony was not broadcast. NASA, cautious about mixing religion and public spaceflight, had asked Aldrin to keep it private, and he did. It was a tiny, intimate act of faith, performed in the most extraordinary setting imaginable, a man giving thanks, in his own quiet way, for the astonishing journey that had brought him to the surface of another world. Whatever you believe or do not believe, there is something tender in the image, a small cup of wine trembling gently in the low gravity, held by human hands so far from home. Among the instruments and experiments the Apollo astronauts left behind on the moon were small panels called retroreflectors, carefully arranged arrays of special mirrors designed to reflect light directly back to its source. These mirrors are still there today, sitting on the lunar surface exactly where they were placed more than 50 years ago, and scientists on Earth still use them. Researchers aim powerful laser beams at the moon, sending pulses of light across the 240,000 miles of empty space between us. And when those beams hit the retroreflectors, a tiny fraction of the light bounces back, By measuring the time it takes for the light to make the round trip, scientists can calculate the distance between the Earth and the Moon with extraordinary precision, down to a matter of millimeters. It is a lovely thing to consider that right now, tonight, there are mirrors sitting in the dust of the Moon that are still catching light we send them, still answering our questions across the void. They are among the quietest experiments ever conducted. No moving parts, no power source, no electronics. Just glass and geometry, waiting in the silence, faithfully sending our light back to us whenever we ask. In total, 12 human beings have walked on the surface of the Moon. All 12 were American men, and all 12 made their journeys between 1969 and 1972 during the Apollo program. 12 people, out of the billions who have lived and breathed on this Earth, have stood on another world, looked up at an alien sky, and felt the crunch of lunar dust beneath their boots. It is a number both remarkable and strangely small. 12. You could fit them all in a single room. You could seat them around a dinner table. And yet, each one of them carried the weight of all humanity on their shoulders as they walked across that grey, silent landscape. They came from different missions, Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17, and each pair left their own footprints, their own flag, their own instruments and memories scattered across different corners of the Moon. And then, after December of 1972, no one went back. The footprints stayed. The flags stayed, the mirrors and instruments stayed, but the humans came home, and for more than 50 years now the Moon has been waiting, quiet and patient, for the next visitor to arrive. In April of 1970, the crew of Apollo 13, astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes, were 2 days into their journey to the Moon when a sudden, violent explosion rocked their spacecraft. An oxygen tank in the service module had ruptured, tearing open the side of the ship, venting their precious oxygen into the vacuum of space and crippling their electrical systems. The Moon landing was immediately abandoned. Survival became the only goal. The 3 men crowded into the lunar module, a small, thin-walled craft designed to land on the Moon, not to sustain 3 people for days, and used it as a lifeboat, rationing power, water and air, while mission control in Houston worked around the clock to bring them home. The temperature inside dropped to near freezing. Condensation formed on the walls. The astronauts were exhausted, dehydrated and cold, but they held on, and the engineers on the ground, hundreds of brilliant, desperate minds working together, found a way. Apollo 13 swung around the far side of the Moon, using its gravity to slingshot back toward Earth. And after 4 harrowing days, the crew splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. They never touched the Moon. But their survival became one of the most celebrated stories in the history of space exploration, a testament to human ingenuity, teamwork, and the quiet refusal to give up. During the Apollo 14 mission in February of 1971, astronaut Alan Shepard, the same man who had been the first American in space 10 years earlier, stood on the surface of the Moon and did something wonderfully, absurdly human. He pulled out a makeshift 6-iron golf club head he had secretly attached to the handle of a lunar sample collector, dropped 2 golf balls into the dust, and swung. In the Moon's gentle gravity, 1/6 of Earth's, the balls sailed in long, lazy arcs across the grey landscape, travelling farther than any golf ball had ever travelled before. Shepard laughed and declared that the second shot went for miles and miles. It probably did not go quite that far. Later estimates suggest it travelled about 200 yards. But in that moment, standing in his bulky white spacesuit on the surface of another world, surrounded by absolute silence and infinite black sky, a man hit a golf ball and laughed. It is one of the most human moments in the history of space exploration. Not a moment of grand speeches or solemn flag plantings, but a moment of pure, childlike play. Even on the Moon, even 240,000 miles from the nearest golf course, we could not resist being ourselves. Across the 6 Apollo missions that successfully landed on the Moon, astronauts collected and brought back approximately 382 kilograms of lunar rocks and soil, about 842 pounds of another world, sealed in carefully labeled containers and carried home aboard their spacecraft. These samples have been studied continuously for more than 50 years, and they have taught us extraordinary things. They revealed that the Moon was likely formed from the debris of a massive collision between the early Earth and a Mars-sized body billions of years ago. They showed us the composition of the lunar surface, the history of ancient volcanic eruptions, the record of meteorite impacts stretching back to the very youth of our solar system. Some of those rocks are older than any rock you will ever find on Earth, over 4 billion years old, silent witnesses to a time before life existed anywhere we know of. And we still have not studied all of them. NASA has kept some samples sealed and untouched, waiting for future technologies that might reveal secrets we cannot yet imagine. 382 kilograms, a handful of moonlight made solid and brought home, still whispering its ancient stories to anyone patient enough to listen. The last person to walk on the Moon was Eugene Cernan, commander of the Apollo 17 mission in December of 1972. Before he climbed the ladder of the lunar module for the final time, Cernan knelt in the dust and traced the initials of his young daughter Tracy into the surface of the Moon. Then he stood, looked out across the silent, sunlit landscape one last time, and spoke. He said that they were leaving as they had come, and God willing, as they would return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Then he climbed inside, sealed the hatch, and left. No human being has walked on the Moon since that day. More than 50 years have passed, and those initials, TDC, are still there, scratched into the lunar dust by a father's gloved finger, undisturbed by wind or rain, preserved in the perfect stillness of a world where nothing erodes, nothing fades, nothing is forgotten. It is a quiet and deeply human monument, not a plaque or a statue, but a father's love, written on another world, waiting in the silence for someone to come back and see it again. In 1971, the Soviet Union launched the world's first space station, a cylindrical vessel called Salyut-1, into orbit around the Earth. It was not large, roughly the size of a small bus, and it was not designed to last forever. But it was the first time human beings had placed a structure in orbit that was meant to be lived in, a place where cosmonauts could stay for days or weeks at a time, eating meals, conducting experiments, sleeping in zero gravity while the Earth turned slowly outside their window. The first crew to successfully dock and live aboard Salyut-1 spent 23 days there, the longest anyone had ever stayed in space at that time. They adapted to the strangeness of weightlessness, learned to move through the narrow corridors by pulling themselves along handrails, and discovered the peculiar beauty of watching water form perfect, trembling spheres in the air. Salyut-1 was modest and imperfect. It had problems with ventilation, with humidity, with the simple logistics of keeping humans comfortable in a place never meant for human comfort. But it was a beginning. The first home away from home, floating 200 miles above the world, lit by sunlight every 45 minutes as it raced through orbit. The United States launched its own first space station in 1973. It was called Skylab, and it was built from a converted upper stage of a Saturn V rocket, the same enormous rocket that had carried astronauts to the Moon. Skylab was larger and more spacious than anything that had come before, offering its crews room to move, to exercise, to look out a large window at the Earth passing below. 3 separate crews visited Skylab over the course of its operational life, staying for periods of 28, 59, and 84 days respectively. The astronauts conducted hundreds of experiments in biology, solar physics, Earth observation, and the effects of long-duration spaceflight on the human body. They also did something no astronauts had done before. They lived in space long enough for it to start feeling something like normal. They developed routines. They had favorite spots to float. They took photographs of the Earth that revealed details never seen from the ground. Skylab was not permanent. It eventually fell back to Earth in 1979, scattering debris across the Indian Ocean and parts of Australia. But for the time it orbited, it was proof that people could not only survive in space but begin, in small and tender ways, to feel at home there. The Soviet space station Mir, a name that means both peace and world in Russian, orbited the Earth from 1986 to 2001, a remarkable 15-year lifespan that made it the longest-serving space station of its era. Mir was assembled piece by piece in orbit, with new modules added over the years like rooms being built onto a house. and over its lifetime it hosted cosmonauts and astronauts from 12 different countries, including several Americans who lived and worked aboard the station during the Shuttle Mir program, a collaborative effort between Russia and the United States. Mir was not always comfortable. It was cramped, occasionally temperamental, and it suffered from aging systems, a serious fire, and a collision with a supply ship. But it was beloved. The people who lived there spoke of it with warmth and affection, the way you might speak of a small, imperfect home that kept you safe through many storms. Mir taught us how to build and maintain a long-duration outpost in space, how to manage the logistics of resupply, how to handle emergencies far from Earth, and how to cooperate across borders in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. When it was finally deorbited in 2001, breaking apart in a streak of fire over the Pacific, it had carried more than 100 people from around the world through the silence of orbit. The International Space Station, known simply as the ISS, is the largest structure human beings have ever built in space. It stretches roughly the length of an American football field, including its enormous solar arrays, and it weighs approximately 420,000 kilograms, nearly 1 million pounds of metal, wiring, laboratories and living quarters, all assembled piece by piece in the vacuum of orbit. It is visible from the ground on clear nights, a bright point of light moving steadily across the sky, and when you see it, you are watching a place where people live, where people are eating dinner or running on a treadmill or looking out the window at the curve of the Earth below. The ISS is not just a machine, it is a home. It has sleeping quarters and a kitchen, exercise equipment and scientific laboratories, and a cupola, a beautiful dome-shaped window module that gives the crew a panoramic view of the planet that has been described by every astronaut who has seen it as life-changing. It is, in many ways, the most extraordinary house ever built, a house that flies, that orbits, that catches the sunlight every 45 minutes and carries its inhabitants around the world 16 times a day. The ISS orbits roughly 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, about 250 miles. That is not as far as you might imagine. It is less than the distance from New York City to Washington, D.C. If you could drive straight up, you would reach the station in about 4 hours, and yet those 400 kilometers change everything. Below that altitude, there is air, there is weather, there are birds and clouds, and the familiar weight of gravity holding everything in its place. Above it, there is nothing but vacuum, silence, and the slow, constant fall of orbit, a perpetual free fall around the Earth that creates the sensation of weightlessness. The astronauts aboard the ISS are not actually free from gravity. The Earth's pull is still strong at that altitude, only about 10% weaker than on the surface. But because the station is falling around the Earth at just the right speed, everything inside it floats. The crew floats. Their food floats. Their tears, when they cry, do not roll down their cheeks but gather into small, trembling spheres that hover in the air like tiny planets. 400 kilometers. Close enough to see the lights of cities below, far enough to float. Construction of the International Space Station began in 1998 and involved the cooperation of 15 countries: the United States, Russia, Japan, Canada, and 11 member nations of the European Space Agency. It was one of the most complex engineering projects in human history, requiring dozens of launches over more than a decade to carry its various modules, trusses, and solar arrays into orbit, where astronauts assembled them piece by piece during hundreds of hours of spacewalks. Each country contributed different parts. Russia built the first module, Zarya, and the service module, Zvezda. The United States provided the laboratory module, Destiny, and the connecting nodes. Japan contributed the Kibo laboratory. Canada built the iconic robotic arm, Canadarm2, which moves along the outside of the station like a gentle mechanical hand, grasping and positioning new components. Europe provided the Columbus laboratory. It was a tapestry of nations, each one weaving its own thread into a structure that belongs to all of them. The ISS is not just a scientific outpost. It is a symbol, imperfect, complicated, and beautiful, of what human beings can build when they decide to work together instead of apart. The International Space Station travels at a speed of approximately 28,000 kilometers per hour, about 17,500 miles per hour. At that velocity, the station crosses the entire continental United States in roughly 10 minutes. It circles the entire Earth in about 90 minutes. If you could somehow stand on the outside of the station and watch, you would see continents scroll past like scenes in a slow, majestic film. The Sahara giving way to the Mediterranean, Europe dissolving into the vast sweep of Russia, the Pacific stretching out in an endless, glittering blue before the coast of North America appeared again on the far horizon. 28,000 kilometers per hour. It is a speed almost beyond comprehension, a speed at which you would travel from London to New York in about 12 minutes. And yet, from inside the station, the crew feels nothing. There is no roar of wind, no sensation of movement, no rattling or shaking. Everything is still, everything floats. The station moves in perfect silence, tracing its great circle around the Earth, carrying its small crew of humans through the void at a speed that would be terrifying if they could feel it, but that instead feels like absolute peace. Because the ISS orbits the Earth once every 90 minutes, the astronauts aboard it witness approximately 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets every 24 hours. Imagine that, 16 times a day, the light shifts from the warm gold of dawn to the deep blue of twilight and then plunges into the black of orbital night, only to brighten again 45 minutes later with another sunrise, another wash of gold and pink and amber spilling across the curved edge of the planet. The crew has described these sunrises as among the most beautiful things they have ever seen. A thin, luminous line of color appearing along the horizon of the Earth, intensifying moment by moment until the sun erupts above the edge of the world and floods the station with light. And then, not long after, the light fades. The Earth's shadow sweeps toward them, and the stars appear, millions of them, sharp and steady, unblinking in the vacuum, brighter than any night sky visible from the ground. 16 sunrises, 16 sunsets, 16 transitions from light to dark and back again, each one slightly different, each one occurring over a different part of the world. It is a rhythm unlike anything on Earth, a day divided not into one long arc of light, but into 16 brief, exquisite pulses of beauty. The record for the longest single spaceflight in history belongs to a Russian cosmonaut named Valery Polyakov, who lived aboard the space station Mir for 437 consecutive days, from January 1994 to March 1995. More than 14 months, more than a full year of floating, of watching the Earth turn, of sleeping in a bag strapped to the wall, of eating food from pouches, of exercising for hours each day to keep his muscles and bones from weakening in the absence of gravity. Polyakov was a physician, and part of the purpose of his mission was to study the effects of long-duration spaceflight on the human body, and the most immediate subject of that study was himself. He documented the changes he felt, the redistribution of fluid that made his face puffy and his legs thin, the slow loss of bone density, the odd adjustment of his sense of balance. But he also adapted. He found routines, rhythms, small comforts. He watched the seasons change on the Earth below. He saw summer turn to autumn, turn to winter, turn to spring, all from his window in the sky. 437 days. When he finally returned to Earth, he insisted on walking from the capsule under his own power, determined to prove that the human body could endure a journey as long as the one to Mars and still come home standing. One of the quiet challenges of living in space is what happens to the human body when it no longer needs to fight gravity. On Earth, the constant pull of gravity forces our bones to stay strong, to maintain their density, to support our weight with every step we take. In space, that pull effectively vanishes. The body, sensing that it no longer needs heavy, dense bones, begins to let them thin, slowly, steadily, like a garden untended. Astronauts aboard the ISS lose approximately 1 to 2% of their bone density per month, primarily in the weight-bearing bones of the hips, spine, and legs. If left unchecked, this loss could lead to conditions similar to osteoporosis, making bones fragile and prone to fracture upon return to Earth. To counteract this, astronauts exercise rigorously, about 2 hours every day, using specially designed resistance machines and treadmills with harnesses that pull them down and simulate the weight their bodies miss. It is a strange and tender image. A person floating in the silence of orbit, strapping themselves to a treadmill and running in place, running against the very absence of the force that shaped their bones since birth, running to keep themselves whole for the day they return to the world that made them. Water is one of the most precious resources on the International Space Station, and not a drop of it is wasted. The station's environmental control system recycles nearly everything. The humidity that forms when astronauts breathe, the sweat that evaporates from their skin during exercise, even their processed urine is filtered and purified back into clean, drinkable water. The system recovers approximately 90% of all water on board, turning what would otherwise be waste into something life-sustaining. It is an extraordinary feat of engineering, and it is absolutely necessary. Launching water from Earth to the ISS is enormously expensive. Every kilogram carried into orbit costs thousands of dollars, so the station must be as self-sufficient as possible. The water that an astronaut drinks in the morning may have been in its previous life the breath of a crewmate, or the condensation on a cold pipe, or something even less poetic. But by the time it reaches their lips, it is pure, cleaner, in fact, than most tap water on Earth. There is a kind of poetry in this, a closed loop of sustenance in which nothing is lost, nothing is discarded, and everything is given a second chance. The International Space Station has been continuously occupied, with at least one person living aboard at all times, since November 2nd, 2000. That means for more than 2 decades, without a single gap, without a single empty day, there have been human beings living in orbit around the Earth. Think about that for a moment. Through the turning of seasons, through elections and celebrations, through the passing of years and the changing of the world below, someone has always been up there, always floating, always watching, always breathing the recycled air and drinking the recycled water and looking out the cupola window at the silent, spinning planet. The crews rotate, of course. New astronauts arrive every few months and others return to Earth, but the station itself has never been empty. It has been a continuously inhabited outpost in space for longer than some of the people who will one day live aboard it have been alive. It is a quiet, extraordinary record. Not a record of speed or distance, but a record of presence, of simply being there, day after day, in the most inhospitable environment human beings have ever chosen to call home. As of early 2024, over 280 people from 23 different countries have visited the International Space Station. They have come from the United States and Russia, of course, the 2 nations that built and operate the bulk of the station, but also from Japan, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, South Korea, the United Arab Emirates, and many others. They have been military pilots and civilian scientists, engineers and educators, and in recent years, private citizens who have traveled to the station aboard commercial spacecraft. Each one of them has floated through the same modules, looked out the same windows, and experienced the same strange, beautiful dislocation of living above the world rather than upon it. The number continues to climb, slowly but steadily, as new missions launch and new partnerships form. 280 people. It is a small number in the grand scale of humanity, but it represents something enormous, a gathering of nations, of cultures, of languages and traditions, all brought together in a single fragile structure orbiting 400 kilometers above the Earth. A small village in the sky populated by the people of many lands. One of the more surprising and delightful effects of living in microgravity is that astronauts grow taller in space. Without the constant downward pull of gravity compressing their spines, the vertebrae gently separate, the discs between them expand, and the spine elongates by as much as 2 inches, roughly 5 centimeters, over the course of a mission. It is as though the body, freed from the weight it has carried since birth, stretches out and breathes, unfolding like a flower opening in the morning. The effect is temporary. Within a few weeks of returning to Earth, gravity does its patient work and the spine compresses back to its original length. But while they are in space, astronauts are measurably taller, taller than they have ever been, taller than they will ever be again once they return to the ground. It is a small, tender fact, one of the countless ways the human body responds to the extraordinary environment of space, and there is something almost whimsical about it. The idea that floating among the stars, even briefly, lets you stretch a little closer toward them. NASA's Space Shuttle program operated from 1981 to 2011, spanning 3 full decades and completing 135 missions. Over that remarkable stretch of time, 5 orbiters, Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, carried astronauts into low Earth orbit again and again, launching vertically on pillars of fire and returning to Earth as gliders, descending without engines through the atmosphere and touching down on long, flat runways in Florida or California. The shuttle was a workhorse, a vehicle of extraordinary versatility that deployed satellites, carried scientific laboratories, ferried supplies and crew to space stations, and served as a platform for some of the most important scientific and engineering achievements in the history of human spaceflight. It was not perfect. It was expensive, complex, and sometimes dangerous. But for 30 years, it was the way Americans went to space, a familiar winged silhouette against the blue Florida sky, rising on a column of white exhaust, climbing steadily into the silence above. 135 flights, 135 times the ground shook and the sky split open, and a crew of human beings rode the fire upward into orbit and then came home again on quiet wings. The first space shuttle to fly was Columbia, which launched on April 12, 1981, exactly 20 years to the day after Yuri Gagarin's historic first flight into space. Astronauts John Young and Robert Crippen rode Columbia into orbit on that maiden voyage, a mission designated STS-1, and for the first time in history, a reusable crewed spacecraft left the Earth, circled the planet, and returned, landing on a dry lakebed runway at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The launch was watched by thousands of spectators who had gathered at the Kennedy Space Center, and when the enormous solid rocket boosters ignited and Columbia rose from the pad, trailing a brilliant white plume against the morning sky, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. The shuttle looked different from anything that had come before. It had wings, a cargo bay, a tail. It looked like something from the future, a spacecraft that could take off like a rocket and land like an airplane. And in that combination of power and grace, there was a promise that space travel could become routine, regular, almost ordinary. That promise would prove more complicated than anyone imagined. But on that April morning in 1981, watching Columbia climb into the sky, the future felt very close and very bright. The Space Shuttle was the first crewed spacecraft designed to be reusable. Every vehicle that had come before, the Mercury capsules, the Gemini capsules, the Apollo command modules, had been single-use. They launched, they flew, they returned, and they were never flown again. The shuttle changed that. Its orbiter, the winged vehicle where the crew lived and worked, was designed to be refurbished after each flight and flown again, mission after mission. The two solid rocket boosters that helped lift it off the pad were recovered from the ocean after each launch, cleaned, refilled with propellant, and used again. Only the large orange external tank, the enormous cylinder that held the liquid hydrogen and oxygen feeding the main engines, was discarded after each flight, tumbling back through the atmosphere and breaking apart over the ocean. The idea behind reusability was elegant and ambitious. By flying the same vehicle again and again, the cost of reaching space would come down dramatically, making spaceflight more accessible and more frequent. In practice, the refurbishment process proved more expensive and time-consuming than hoped, but the concept endured, planting a seed that would eventually blossom decades later in the rockets of a new generation. On June 18, 1983, a physicist and astronaut named Sally Ride launched aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger and became the first American woman to travel into space. She was 32 years old, calm and composed, and she had been selected from among 8,000 applicants to join NASA's astronaut corps. Ride was not interested in being a symbol. She wanted to be a scientist, an astronaut, a crew member. But the significance of the moment was undeniable. 20 years after Valentina Tereshkova had orbited the Earth alone in her Vostok capsule, an American woman was finally making her own journey into the void. Ride operated the shuttle's robotic arm during the mission, deploying satellites with precision and grace, and she later described the experience of spaceflight with a quiet intensity: the shattering roar of launch, the sudden silence of orbit, the breathtaking view of the Earth's thin atmosphere glowing along the horizon. She flew into space a second time the following year, and after leaving NASA, she dedicated her life to encouraging young people, especially girls, to pursue science and exploration. She understood, perhaps better than most, that the path to the stars is one that must be open to everyone. In August of 1983, just 2 months after Sally Ride's flight, astronaut Guion Bluford launched aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger and became the first African American to travel into space. Bluford was an aerospace engineer and a decorated Air Force pilot, a man of quiet intensity and deep competence, and his mission, STS-8, was the first shuttle flight to launch and land at night. The darkness outside the windows was total during ascent, the only light coming from the brilliant flame of the engines and the glowing instruments of the cockpit. Bluford conducted experiments in the shuttle's middeck, studying the behavior of living cells in microgravity and operating a device that separated biological materials using electrical fields. He was precise, thorough, professional. And though he, like Reid, preferred to be recognized for his work rather than his identity, the moment carried a profound weight. The sky, which had once been a place only certain people were allowed to dream of reaching, was opening. It was widening. And with each new face, each new story, each new pair of hands reaching for the stars, the future of spaceflight was becoming more honest, more complete, more like the world it was meant to represent. On the morning of January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida under a cold, bright sky. The temperature that morning was unusually low, below freezing, and engineers had raised concerns about the effect of the cold on the rubber O-ring seals in the solid rocket boosters. Their concerns were overridden. 73 seconds after launch, a plume of hot gas escaped through a failed seal, struck the external tank, and triggered a catastrophic structural failure. The shuttle broke apart in a forking trail of white smoke against the blue sky, and all 7 crew members were lost. The nation watched in real time, many of them in schools and living rooms, because this flight had captured special attention. It was carrying a teacher. The disaster shook the space program to its core. Flights were suspended for nearly 3 years while investigators determined the cause, and NASA redesigned the booster seals and reformed its safety culture. It was a wound that never fully healed, a reminder, quiet and permanent, that the journey into space is never routine, never safe, and that the people who ride the fire upward do so with a courage that most of us will never be asked to summon. Among the 7 crew members lost in the Challenger disaster was Sharon Krista McAuliffe, a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who had been selected from more than 11,000 applicants to become the first private citizen and the first teacher to fly in space. The program was called the Teacher in Space Project, and its aim was beautiful in its simplicity: to send an ordinary teacher into orbit so that she could conduct lessons from space, beaming them back to classrooms across the country, showing children that the sky was not a limit, but an invitation. McAuliffe was warm, enthusiastic, and deeply loved by her students, her community, and a nation that had embraced her as a symbol of the idea that space belonged to everyone, not just pilots and engineers, but teachers and dreamers and ordinary people with extraordinary curiosity. Her loss was felt with a particular sharpness, not only because she was a civilian among military-trained astronauts, but because she represented a promise that one day going to space would be as natural as going to school. That promise was delayed by the tragedy, but it was not destroyed. It lives on in every teacher who points at the sky and tells their students what is possible. On February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia, the very same orbiter that had been the first to fly in 1981, broke apart during re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, killing all 7 crew members aboard. The cause was traced to a piece of foam insulation that had broken off from the external tank during launch 16 days earlier, striking the leading edge of Columbia's left wing and creating a breach in the thermal protection tiles. During re-entry, superheated gases entered through this breach, destroying the internal structure of the wing, and the orbiter disintegrated over the skies of Texas and Louisiana, scattering debris across a vast area. The crew had spent 16 days in orbit conducting scientific experiments, unaware of the damage to their wing, unaware that the tiles meant to protect them from the searing heat of re-entry had been compromised. The loss of Columbia, like the loss of Challenger 17 years before, was a profound and devastating blow to the space program and to the nation. It led to another long suspension of flights, another investigation, another reckoning with the risks inherent in sending human beings through the atmosphere on tongues of flame. 14 crew members lost across 2 disasters, 14 lives given to the sky, carried gently now in the memory of everyone who remembers. In April of 1990, the Space Shuttle Discovery carried one of the most important scientific instruments ever built into orbit and released it gently into the void. The instrument was the Hubble Space Telescope, a cylindrical observatory about the size of a school bus, fitted with a 2.4-meter mirror designed to capture light from the farthest reaches of the universe. Hubble was placed in orbit approximately 540 kilometers above the Earth, high enough to float above the blurring, bending effects of the atmosphere that limit ground-based telescopes, and from there it began to look outward, deeper and more clearly than any telescope had ever looked before. Over the decades that followed, Hubble would transform our understanding of the cosmos, capturing images of distant galaxies, dying stars, vast nebulae where new stars were being born, and the deep, ancient light of galaxies so far away that their light had been traveling toward us for billions of years. It showed us the universe in colors and details we had never imagined, and it did so from a perch just above our atmosphere, a quiet eye floating in the dark, turning its gaze outward on behalf of everyone on the world below. In December of 1962, a small American spacecraft called Mariner 2 swept past the planet Venus, becoming the first successful interplanetary probe in history, the first machine made by human hands to visit another planet and send information home. Mariner 2 had traveled for 3.5 months across the void, a journey of more than 36 million miles, guided by nothing but mathematics and the gentle nudge of its onboard thrusters. As it flew past Venus, it measured the planet's surface temperature, scanned its thick, opaque atmosphere, and confirmed something scientists had suspected but never proven. Venus was extraordinarily hot, far hotter than anyone had imagined, its surface baked by a runaway greenhouse effect that trapped heat beneath its dense clouds of sulfuric acid. Mariner 2 carried no camera. It could not take pictures. And so it saw Venus not with eyes but with instruments, feeling the planet's heat and magnetic field the way a hand might feel the warmth of a candle in the dark. It was a quiet encounter, a brief whisper of data sent across millions of miles, but it was the first. The first time we reached out and touched another world, even if only with radio waves and sensors. The first time another planet answered our questions. In December of 1970, the Soviet probe Venera 7 descended through the crushing, searing atmosphere of Venus and landed on its surface, becoming the first spacecraft to successfully land on another planet and transmit data back to Earth. The conditions it endured were almost beyond imagining. Venus's atmosphere is nearly 100 times denser than Earth's, and its surface temperature hovers around 465 degrees Celsius, roughly 870 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt lead, hot enough to glow faintly in the dark. The pressure at the surface is equivalent to being nearly a kilometer beneath the ocean on Earth. Venera 7 survived on the surface for about 23 minutes before succumbing to the heat and pressure, but in those 23 minutes it sent back temperature readings that confirmed Venus was one of the most hostile places in the known solar system. It is a humbling thought that our closest planetary neighbor, a world so similar to Earth in size and mass that it is sometimes called our sister planet, is a place of such ferocious, unforgiving extremes. And yet, we went there. We sent a machine into that inferno, and for 23 minutes it spoke to us from the surface of another world. The surface of Venus is one of the most violently inhospitable places in our solar system. The temperature there hovers around 465 degrees Celsius, approximately 870 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt lead, hot enough to soften and deform many metals that we consider sturdy and strong here on Earth. This extraordinary heat is not caused by proximity to the Sun. Venus is only slightly closer to the Sun than Earth is, but by a runaway greenhouse effect. Venus's thick, dense atmosphere, composed almost entirely of carbon dioxide, traps heat with devastating efficiency, wrapping the planet in a blanket of insulating gas so thick that virtually no warmth escapes back into space. The surface pressure is crushing, about 90 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level on Earth, and the clouds that hide the surface from view are made not of water but of sulfuric acid. It is a world that looks, from a distance, serene and beautiful, a bright, creamy point of light in the evening or morning sky, but beneath those elegant clouds lies a landscape of volcanic rock, scorched and pressurized and utterly inhospitable to life as we know it. Venus is a gentle reminder from the cosmos that beauty and danger are not opposites, and that the loveliest things in the sky may hold the fiercest secrets. In 1974, a small NASA spacecraft called Mariner 10 became the first to visit the planet Mercury, the smallest and innermost world in our solar system. Mariner 10 used a gravity assist from Venus, swinging past one planet to gain the speed and trajectory needed to reach another. and then made 3 separate flybys of Mercury in 1974 and 1975, capturing the first close-up images of its cratered, sun-blasted surface. Mercury is a world of extremes. Its daytime temperatures can reach over 400 degrees Celsius, while its nighttime temperatures plummet to nearly -180 degrees, because the planet has virtually no atmosphere to hold onto warmth or distribute it evenly. It is battered and ancient, its surface pocked with impact craters that have remained unchanged for billions of years, and it orbits so close to the Sun that a year on Mercury, one complete trip around the Sun, lasts only 88 Earth days. Mariner 10 revealed this harsh, stark world to human eyes for the first time, sending back images of a landscape that looked eerily similar to our own moon, grey, cratered, and silent, but baked by a star so close it fills the Mercurian sky with a light 3 times brighter than anything we see on Earth. For decades after Mariner 10's brief flybys, Mercury remained one of the least explored planets in our solar system. That changed in 2011 when NASA's Messenger spacecraft entered orbit around Mercury and began the first comprehensive survey of the planet's surface, composition, and magnetic field. Messenger orbited the small planet for 4 years, circling it more than 4,000 times and mapping its entire surface in extraordinary detail. It discovered that Mercury's North Pole, despite the planet's proximity to the Sun, contains water ice hidden in the permanent shadows of deep craters, places where sunlight has never reached, where the temperature stays cold enough for ice to persist for billions of years. It measured the planet's unexpectedly active magnetic field, studied the composition of its surface rocks, and revealed that Mercury had been shaped by ancient volcanic eruptions far more extensive than anyone had guessed. In 2015, its fuel exhausted, Messenger was deliberately crashed into Mercury's surface, creating a small new crater on a world already covered in millions of them. One last, gentle mark left by a machine that had spent 4 years faithfully studying a world no human being has ever visited. Mars has been visited by more spacecraft than any other planet in our solar system. Since the early 1960s, over 50 missions have been sent toward the Red Planet. Orbiters, landers, rovers, and helicopters from the United States, the Soviet Union, Europe, India, China, Japan, and the United Arab Emirates. Not all of them succeeded. Mars has a reputation among engineers as a difficult destination, a place where things go wrong, signal lost, landing failed, parachute tangled, and the history of Mars exploration is littered with noble attempts that ended in silence. But many succeeded, and those successes have revealed a world of staggering complexity and beauty. Towering volcanoes, vast canyon systems, polar ice caps, ancient riverbeds, and dune fields that ripple across the surface like frozen waves. Mars is cold and dry and thin-aired today, but the evidence suggests it was not always so. Billions of years ago, water flowed on its surface, pooled in lakes and perhaps even oceans. And the great question that drives so much of our exploration is whether life, even simple microbial life, ever took root there in those warmer, wetter days. Every spacecraft we send is, in its own way, an attempt to answer that question, a gentle knock on the door of another world, asking, was anyone ever home? On July 20th, 1976, exactly 7 years after the Apollo 11 moon landing, NASA's Viking 1 lander touched down on the surface of Mars and became the first spacecraft to successfully land on the Red Planet and send back photographs. The images it returned were astonishing, a rocky, rust-colored landscape stretching to a pink-hued horizon under a butterscotch sky. For the first time, human beings could see what it looked like to stand on the surface of another planet. The rocks were scattered and angular, the soil fine and reddish, and the sky, colored by fine dust particles suspended in the thin Martian atmosphere, glowed with a warm, amber light that no one had expected. Viking 1 also carried instruments designed to test the Martian soil for signs of life, scooping up samples and subjecting them to chemical experiments. The results were ambiguous, tantalizing enough to spark decades of debate, but not conclusive enough to declare that life had been found. Viking 1 operated on the Martian surface for over 6 years, far exceeding its designed lifespan, faithfully sending data and images back across the millions of miles to Earth, a patient, tireless observer sitting in the dust of another world, watching the Martian seasons turn. In 1997, a small rover no larger than a microwave oven rolled down a ramp from the Mars Pathfinder lander and onto the surface of Mars, becoming the first rover to successfully operate on another planet. Its name was Sojourner, and it weighed just over 10 kilograms, about the weight of a medium-sized dog. Sojourner moved slowly, carefully, navigating the rocky terrain around its landing site with the patient deliberation of a creature learning to walk in a new world. It analyzed the composition of Martian rocks with an instrument called an alpha-proton X-ray spectrometer, pressing its sensor against stones that had names like Barnacle Bill and Yogi, names given by scientists on Earth who watched the rover's progress with a mixture of wonder and affection. Sojourner operated for 83 days, far longer than its planned 7-day mission, and in that time it traveled a total of about 100 meters, roughly the length of a football field. It is worth noting that a Soviet rover called Prop-M had actually landed on Mars much earlier in 1971 aboard the Mars 3 lander, but the lander failed just 20 seconds after touchdown and the rover never deployed. So Sojourner holds the distinction of being the first rover to truly explore the surface of another planet, rolling slowly across the red dust, small and brave and very far from home. In January of 2004, NASA landed 2 identical rovers on opposite sides of Mars. Their names were Spirit and Opportunity, and they were designed to last 90 days each, 3 months of driving, photographing and analyzing the Martian surface before the dust and cold were expected to shut them down. Spirit lasted 6 years, finally falling silent in 2010 after becoming stuck in soft soil. But Opportunity was extraordinary. The rover that was built to last 3 months operated for more than 14 years, traversing over 45 kilometers of Martian terrain, climbing hills, descending into craters, and making discovery after discovery about the planet's watery past. Opportunity found evidence of ancient water, minerals and rock formations that could only have been created in the presence of liquid water. And it sent back some of the most beautiful images ever captured on Mars, including panoramic vistas of vast, lonely landscapes that stretched to the horizon under a pale, dusty sky. In June of 2018, a massive dust storm engulfed the planet, blocking the sunlight that powered Opportunity's solar panels. The rover fell silent. NASA tried for months to re-establish contact, sending over 1,000 commands into the Martian sky, but Opportunity never answered. Its final communication, translated from telemetry data, essentially said, "My battery is low and it is getting dark." It is perhaps the most quietly heartbreaking sentence ever sent from another world. NASA's Curiosity rover landed on Mars in August of 2012, touching down inside Gale Crater after a harrowing descent that involved a supersonic parachute, retro rockets, and a sky crane that lowered the rover gently to the surface on cables. A landing sequence so complex and audacious that engineers nicknamed it 7 Minutes of Terror. Curiosity is much larger than the rovers that came before it, about the size of a small car weighing roughly 900 kilograms. And unlike Spirit and Opportunity, it is powered not by solar panels but by a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, a device that converts the heat from decaying plutonium into electricity, allowing the rover to operate day and night through dust storms and the long Martian winter. Curiosity has been exploring Mars for more than a decade now, climbing the slopes of Mount Sharp, a layered mountain of sedimentary rock rising from the center of Gale Crater, reading the geological history of Mars like the pages of a book, each layer revealing a different chapter in the planet's ancient past. It has found organic molecules, evidence of ancient lakes, and the chemical building blocks that suggest Mars was once a place where life could have thrived. And still it drives, and still it studies, and still it sends its findings home across the millions of miles of empty space, a tireless explorer the size of a small automobile rolling slowly through the silence of another world. In February of 2021, NASA's Perseverance rover landed on Mars in Jezero Crater, a site chosen because it appears to have once been a lake fed by an ancient river delta. Exactly the kind of place where, if microbial life ever existed on Mars, its traces might be preserved in the rock. Perseverance carries the most sophisticated suite of scientific instruments ever sent to the Martian surface, including cameras capable of capturing images in extraordinary detail, instruments that can analyze the chemical composition of rocks from a distance using lasers, and a device called MOXIE that has demonstrated the ability to extract oxygen from Mars's carbon dioxide atmosphere. a technology that could one day help sustain human explorers on the red planet. But perhaps the most important task Perseverance is performing is something no rover has done before. It is carefully selecting, drilling, and sealing samples of Martian rock and soil into small, airtight tubes, which it leaves on the surface for a future mission to collect and return to Earth. Each sealed tube is a tiny time capsule, a promise between the present and the future, a small container of Mars waiting patiently in the dust for the day it will be picked up and brought home. Tucked beneath the belly of the Perseverance rover when it landed on Mars was a small, lightweight helicopter called Ingenuity. It weighed just 1.8 kilograms, about 4 pounds, roughly the weight of a small pineapple, and its mission was simple and profound: to prove that powered, controlled flight was possible in the thin atmosphere of Mars. The Martian atmosphere is less than 1% as dense as Earth's, which means there is almost nothing for rotor blades to push against, almost no air to bite into and lift against gravity. Flying on Mars is roughly equivalent to flying at an altitude of 100,000 feet on Earth, higher than any helicopter has ever flown here. And yet, on April 19, 2021, Ingenuity spun its twin carbon fiber rotors at over 2,500 revolutions per minute, lifted off the Martian surface, hovered for about 30 seconds at an altitude of 3 meters, and gently set itself back down. It was the first powered, controlled flight on another planet, the Wright brothers moment of another world. A small machine, far from home, rising into the thin Martian air on rotors that spun faster than the eye could follow, proving that even in a sky with almost no air, we could find a way to fly. Ingenuity was designed as a technology demonstration, a small experiment with a planned lifespan of just 5 flights over 30 days. Engineers hoped it would prove the concept and then be left behind as Perseverance drove on. But Ingenuity did not stop at 5 flights. It flew again and again and again, each flight growing bolder, longer, faster, climbing higher and covering more ground than the last. It became an aerial scout for Perseverance, scouting terrain ahead of the rover, photographing the Martian landscape from above, helping scientists choose the best paths and the most interesting rock formations to investigate. Over nearly 3 years of operations, Ingenuity completed 72 flights, more than 14 times its original mission plan, traveling a total distance of over 17 kilometers and reaching altitudes of up to 24 meters. Its mission finally ended in January of 2024, when one of its rotor blades was damaged during landing, ending its ability to fly. But by then, the little helicopter had already rewritten what we thought was possible. A machine that weighed less than a bag of sugar had flown 72 times on another planet, and in doing so, it had opened the sky of Mars, that thin, cold, seemingly impossible sky, to the future of aerial exploration. In September of 2023, a NASA spacecraft called OSIRIS-REx completed one of the most extraordinary round trips in the history of space exploration. It had launched 7 years earlier, in 2016, traveled to a small dark asteroid called Bennu, a rubble pile asteroid only about 500 meters across, orbiting the Sun between Earth and Mars. And in October of 2020, it briefly touched the asteroid's surface with a robotic arm, collecting a sample of rock and dust in a maneuver that lasted only a few seconds. Then it began the long journey home. When the sample return capsule parachuted down to the Utah desert in September of 2023, it carried approximately 121 grams of asteroid material, just over 4 ounces, a small handful of primordial matter from a body that has remained virtually unchanged for over 4.5 billion years. This material dates from the very birth of our solar system, from a time before Earth existed, before the planets had finished forming, and scientists believe it may contain organic molecules, water-bearing minerals, and clues about the building blocks of life itself. A small handful of dust and rock, older than anything on Earth, carried home across hundreds of millions of miles of empty space, now resting in a clean room in Houston, being studied with the care and reverence usually reserved for sacred things, because in a way, it is sacred. It is a piece of the beginning. In 1972, NASA launched Pioneer 10, a small but ambitious spacecraft on a trajectory that would carry it farther from Earth than anything had ever traveled before. Pioneer 10 was the first spacecraft to pass through the asteroid belt, that vast ring of rocky debris orbiting the Sun between Mars and Jupiter, and the first to fly past the giant planet Jupiter, reaching it in December of 1973. As it swept past Jupiter, Pioneer 10 sent back the first close-up images of the planet's turbulent, swirling atmosphere, its bands of cloud in shades of cream and rust and amber, its great red spot, a storm larger than the entire Earth that has been raging for centuries. Pioneer 10 measured Jupiter's intense radiation belts, its powerful magnetic field, and the composition of its upper atmosphere. And then it kept going, outward, away from the Sun, into the deep and ever-darkening reaches of the outer solar system. It was the first human-made object to travel beyond the orbit of all the known planets, sailing silently into interstellar space, growing fainter and more distant with every passing year. NASA received its last faint signal in 2003, more than 30 years after launch, by which time Pioneer 10 was over 12 billion kilometers from Earth, a whisper from the edge of everything we have ever known. Bolted to the side of Pioneer 10 and its twin, Pioneer 11, is a small gold-anodized aluminum plaque, about 15 centimeters by 23 centimeters, designed to communicate with anyone or anything that might one day find the spacecraft drifting through the void. The plaque was designed by astronomers Carl Sagan and Frank Drake, and it carries a set of simple, universal diagrams, the figures of a man and a woman drawn to scale beside the spacecraft itself, a diagram of our solar system with an arrow showing the spacecraft's trajectory from the third planet outward, a map of 14 pulsars, rapidly spinning neutron stars, arranged to show the position of our Sun relative to the center of the galaxy, and a representation of the hydrogen atom, the most common element in the universe, whose fundamental properties could serve as a key to decoding the other symbols. It is a message in a bottle, cast into the cosmic ocean. The chances that any intelligence will ever find it are vanishingly small. Space is vast beyond imagining, and Pioneer 10 is a tiny, tiny thing. But the act of sending it is itself a kind of prayer, a declaration of hope, a way of saying, we were here, we were curious, and we reached out to you, whoever you are, wherever and whenever you might be. In the summer of 1977, NASA launched 2 spacecraft that would become the most far-traveled ambassadors in human history. Their names were Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, and they were designed to take advantage of a rare alignment of the outer planets, an arrangement that occurs only once every 175 years that would allow a single spacecraft to fly past Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, using each planet's gravity to slingshot it toward the next. Both Voyagers completed their primary missions decades ago, but they did not stop. They kept going outward past the orbit of Pluto, past the edge of the solar wind's influence, and into the vast, cold, quiet expanse of interstellar space, the space between the stars. And astonishingly, both of them are still transmitting. Their signals are faint, barely a whisper by the time they reach the antennas on Earth. But they are there, carrying data from a region of space that no human-made object had ever explored before. More than 4 decades after launch, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 are still talking to us, still sending their quiet messages home from the darkness, like voices calling from the far side of an ocean that has no shore. Voyager 1 holds the distinction of being the most distant human-made object in existence. As of 2024, it is more than 24 billion kilometers from Earth, a distance so vast that the light carrying its signals traveling at the fastest speed possible in the universe takes more than 22 hours to reach us. When scientists on Earth send a command to Voyager 1, they must wait nearly 2 full days for the round-trip communication, a day for the signal to arrive and a day for the response to return. Voyager 1 is now in interstellar space, beyond the influence of the Sun's solar wind, drifting through a region of cold, thin gas and faint starlight that stretches between the stars of our galaxy. It is traveling at roughly 17 kilometers per second, about 38,000 miles per hour. And even at that extraordinary speed, it will take tens of thousands of years before it comes anywhere near another star. It is alone out there, in a way that nothing has ever been alone before. A small aging machine, carrying a record of golden sounds and images from Earth, sailing through the silence between the stars, farther from home than any creation of ours has ever been. Both Voyager spacecraft carry with them one of the most beautiful and hopeful objects ever created by human hands, the Golden Record. It is a 12-inch gold-plated copper phonograph record enclosed in a protective aluminum jacket with a stylus and symbolic instructions for how to play it etched onto the cover. The record contains 116 images of life on Earth: people, animals, landscapes, architecture, scientific diagrams, along with greetings spoken in 55 different languages, a selection of natural sounds including thunder, birdsong, whale calls, and the laughter of a child, and 90 minutes of music drawn from cultures around the world, from Beethoven to Chuck Berry, from Javanese gamelan to Navajo night chant. It is a portrait of our world compressed onto a single disc of gold, a message to the cosmos from a civilization that wanted to say, "This is who we are, this is what we love. This is what our world sounds like when it is at its most beautiful." The golden record will outlast every building, every city, every monument on Earth. Long after the sun has dimmed and the Earth is gone, those two small golden discs will still be drifting through the dark, carrying the sound of our music and the images of our faces and the whisper of our hope into the endless, patient future. While Voyager 1 took a path that carried it past Jupiter and Saturn before heading upward out of the plane of the solar system, Voyager 2 followed a more winding route, and in doing so it became the only spacecraft in history to visit all 4 of the giant outer planets: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. It flew past Jupiter in 1979, revealing the intricate detail of the planet's banded atmosphere and discovering active volcanoes on its moon Io. It reached Saturn in 1981, studying the planet's magnificent ring system and the complex surface of its moon Titan. It arrived at Uranus in 1986, the first and so far only spacecraft to visit that pale blue-green ice giant, revealing a world tipped on its side with a system of faint, dark rings and 27 known moons. And finally, in 1989, it flew past Neptune, the most distant planet in our solar system, capturing images of its vivid blue atmosphere, its violent storms, and its large, mysterious moon Triton, whose surface of frozen nitrogen geysers suggested a world far more active than anyone had expected. 4 planets, 4 encounters, 4 utterly different worlds, each one revealed for the first time by a single small spacecraft that had been traveling for over a decade. Voyager 2's grand tour remains one of the greatest journeys of exploration in human history. In 1995, a NASA spacecraft called Galileo arrived at Jupiter and became the first to orbit the giant planet, spending the next 8 years studying Jupiter and its family of moons in extraordinary detail. Among its most profound discoveries was evidence that Europa, one of Jupiter's 4 large moons, a world slightly smaller than Earth's moon, covered in a smooth shell of ice, likely harbors a vast ocean of liquid water beneath its frozen surface. Galileo detected signs of this ocean through measurements of Europa's magnetic field, which behaved in ways consistent with a layer of electrically conductive salt water hidden below the ice. The idea was staggering. Here was a world far from the sun, far from the warmth we associate with life, and yet beneath its icy crust, there might be more liquid water than in all of Earth's oceans combined. Where there is liquid water, there is the possibility of life. Not guaranteed, not certain, but possible. And Europa has since become one of the most exciting destinations in our solar system, a place where the answer to one of humanity's deepest questions, are we alone, might one day be found not on a warm, sunlit world, but in the dark, hidden waters of a frozen moon, kept warm by the gentle, rhythmic tidal pull of Jupiter itself. In 2004, after a 7-year journey across the solar system, NASA's Cassini spacecraft arrived at Saturn and entered orbit around the ringed planet, beginning what would become one of the most spectacular and scientifically productive missions in the history of space exploration. For 13 years, Cassini circled Saturn, studying the planet's atmosphere, its magnetic field, its intricate and beautiful ring system, and its astonishing collection of more than 80 moons. It revealed that Saturn's rings, while they appear solid from a distance, are made of countless individual particles of ice and rock, ranging in size from tiny grains to boulders the size of houses, all orbiting in thin, elegant bands that shimmer and shift in the sunlight. Cassini discovered new moons, observed massive storms erupting in Saturn's atmosphere, and measured the planet's seasons as they shifted over the course of more than half a Saturnian year. When its mission was finally complete and its fuel nearly exhausted, Cassini was deliberately plunged into Saturn's atmosphere in September of 2017, burning up like a meteor to ensure that it could never accidentally contaminate one of Saturn's potentially habitable moons. It ended as it had lived, with grace, with purpose, and with a final act of care for the worlds it had spent 13 years studying. One of Cassini's most astonishing and unexpected discoveries came from Enceladus, a small, icy moon of Saturn only about 500 kilometers across. In 2005, Cassini flew past Enceladus and detected something remarkable: enormous geysers of water ice and vapor erupting from cracks near the moon's south pole, shooting hundreds of kilometers into space in great, shimmering plumes. These geysers were evidence of a subsurface ocean, a body of liquid water hidden beneath the moon's frozen crust, kept warm by tidal forces generated by Saturn's immense gravity. Cassini flew through these plumes multiple times, sampling the material as it passed, and found not only water but also organic molecules, salts and silica particles, chemical signatures consistent with hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, similar to the deep-sea vents on Earth where life thrives in the absence of sunlight. The discovery transformed Enceladus from an obscure, icy satellite into one of the most promising places in our solar system to search for extraterrestrial life. Somewhere beneath the frozen surface of that tiny moon, in an ocean that no sunlight has ever touched, there may be warmth, there may be chemistry, and there may, just possibly, be something alive. The geysers of Enceladus are, in a sense, that ocean's way of reaching out to us, sending samples of itself into space, as if offering a whispered invitation. Come closer, come look, come see what I have been hiding. Carried aboard the Cassini spacecraft was a small probe called Huygens, built by the European Space Agency, designed for a single extraordinary purpose: to descend through the thick atmosphere of Saturn's largest moon, Titan, and land on its surface. On January 14, 2005, Huygens separated from Cassini and began its plunge, parachuting slowly through Titan's dense, hazy atmosphere for about 2.5 hours, measuring temperature, pressure, wind speed, and atmospheric composition as it fell. When it finally touched down on the surface of Titan, some 1.2 billion kilometers from Earth, it became the most distant landing ever achieved by a human-made spacecraft. The images it sent back were haunting and alien. A landscape of rounded, ice-pebbled terrain, smooth and dark, with channels carved by flowing liquid and a horizon lost in an orange, smoggy haze. The temperature was -179 degrees Celsius, and the liquid that flowed on Titan's surface was not water but methane, the same substance that fuels stoves on Earth. But here, in this unimaginable cold, it behaved like water, pooling in lakes and carving rivers through the landscape. Huygens transmitted data for about 72 minutes after landing before its batteries faded and it fell silent forever. A small machine resting on the surface of a world so distant that its signal, traveling at the speed of light, took over an hour to reach our ears. Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, is one of the most extraordinary and alien worlds in our solar system. It is the only moon known to possess a thick, substantial atmosphere, denser even than Earth's, and it is the only place in the solar system besides Earth where stable bodies of liquid exist on the surface. But the liquid on Titan is not water. The surface temperature, at roughly -179 degrees Celsius, is far too cold for water to exist as a liquid. Instead, Titan's lakes, rivers and seas are filled with liquid methane and ethane, hydrocarbons that, under the frigid conditions of this distant moon, behave the way water does on Earth, flowing downhill, pooling in low places, evaporating into the atmosphere, forming clouds and falling back as rain. It is an entire weather cycle, an entire hydrological system built from different chemistry but following the same gentle, familiar patterns. Radar mapping by the Cassini spacecraft revealed great dark seas near Titan's North Pole, some of them hundreds of kilometers across, their surfaces smooth and mirror still. There are rivers that wind through valleys and shorelines where the liquid meets the land. It is not our world, not by any measure, and yet in its rhythms and its landscapes there is something recognizable, something that whispers of rain and rivers and the quiet, ancient patience of flowing things. In July of 2015, after a journey of more than 9 years and 3 billion miles, NASA's New Horizons spacecraft flew past Pluto. the small distant world at the edge of our solar system that had been little more than a blurry dot in even our best telescopes. What New Horizons revealed was breathtaking. Pluto was not the dead, featureless ball of ice that many had expected. It was a world of astonishing complexity and beauty. Its surface was covered in vast plains of nitrogen ice, towering mountains made of water ice as hard as rock in the extreme cold, glaciers that appeared to flow slowly across the landscape, and a thin, hazy atmosphere that scattered sunlight into a soft blue glow around the planet's edge. Most striking of all was a vast, heart-shaped feature on Pluto's surface, a bright, smooth plain of nitrogen ice that scientists named Tombor Regio, after Clyde Tombaugh, the astronomer who discovered Pluto in 1930. The heart of Pluto, glowing pale and luminous in the images sent back across 3 billion miles, captured the imagination of the world. Here was a tiny frozen world at the very edge of our solar neighborhood, and it had a heart. It had mountains and glaciers and a sky. It was, against all expectations, beautiful. After its encounter with Pluto, New Horizons kept flying deeper into the Kuiper Belt, the vast cold ring of icy objects that extends beyond the orbit of Neptune. On January 1st, 2019, the spacecraft flew past a small, distant object called Arakoth, a Kuiper Belt object roughly 35 kilometers long, orbiting the Sun more than 6.5 billion kilometers from Earth. Arakoth became the most distant object ever visited by a human-made spacecraft, and when its images arrived back on Earth, they revealed something strange and wonderful. Arakoth was shaped like a snowman, composed of 2 roughly spherical lobes gently joined together, as though 2 objects had drifted together in the ancient past and stuck very softly, like 2 soap bubbles meeting. Its surface was smooth and reddish, largely free of impact craters, suggesting that the Kuiper Belt, at this great distance from the Sun, is a place of remarkable calm, a region where objects drift slowly and collisions are rare, where things have remained largely undisturbed for billions of years. Arakoth is a fossil, a relic from the earliest days of our solar system, preserved in the deep cold like a flower pressed in the pages of a very old book. And New Horizons showed it to us, from 4 billion miles away, in a whisper of radio waves that took over 6 hours to travel home. Since 2016, NASA's Juno spacecraft has been orbiting Jupiter, studying the giant planet's atmosphere, magnetic field, and deep interior structure with a level of detail never before achieved. Juno travels in a highly elongated polar orbit, swooping close to Jupiter's cloud tops, sometimes within a few thousand kilometers, before swinging back out to a safe distance, each pass providing a new set of measurements and images. The photographs Juno has returned are among the most beautiful ever taken of any planet. Swirling storms in shades of blue, white, and amber, cyclones arranged in geometric patterns around the poles, and the intricate, turbulent beauty of Jupiter's cloud bands, which look less like weather and more like the brushstrokes of some vast, abstract painting. Juno has peered beneath those clouds using microwave instruments, revealing that Jupiter's famous belts and zones extend deep into the planet's atmosphere, and that its core is not the small, solid ball that scientists once imagined, but a diffuse, partially dissolved region where heavy elements mix with hydrogen under unimaginable pressures. Jupiter, the largest planet in our solar system, a world that could contain more than 1,300 Earths inside it, is slowly giving up its secrets to this small, spinning sentinel in orbit around it, and what it is revealing is more complex, more dynamic, and more beautiful than we ever knew. The Hubble Space Telescope has been orbiting the Earth since April of 1990, circling the planet every 97 minutes at an altitude of about 540 kilometers, and in that time it has made more than 1.6 million observations of the universe. It has peered into the birthplaces of stars, where vast clouds of gas and dust collapse under their own gravity and ignite into new suns. It has captured the death throes of massive stars, their outer layers blown into space in spectacular glowing nebulae. It has measured the distances to faraway galaxies, helping to determine the age and expansion rate of the universe itself. It has revealed that nearly every large galaxy harbors a supermassive black hole at its center, and it has looked deeper into space, and therefore further back in time, than any telescope before it. capturing images of galaxies so distant that their light began traveling toward us more than 13 billion years ago, when the universe was young and the first stars were just beginning to shine. Hubble has changed not just our knowledge of the cosmos, but our relationship with it. Its images, vivid, detailed, otherworldly, have become part of our shared visual vocabulary, icons of beauty and wonder that have inspired millions of people to look up and feel, even for a moment, the vast and gentle immensity of the universe we live in. When Hubble first opened its eye in orbit in 1990, something was wrong. The images it sent back were blurry, out of focus, not nearly as sharp as they should have been. Engineers quickly discovered the problem. The telescope's primary mirror, a 2.4-meter disc of glass that had been ground and polished with extraordinary care, had a flaw. It had been shaped to the wrong curvature, a manufacturing error of roughly 2 microns, about 1/50th the thickness of a human hair. It was an almost impossibly small mistake, but for a telescope designed to capture light from the edge of the observable universe, it was enough to blur everything. The world was disappointed. Hubble, which had been decades in the making and had cost billions of dollars, seemed to be a failure. But then, in December of 1993, NASA launched a space shuttle mission, STS-61, to fix it. Over the course of 5 spacewalks spanning 11 days, astronauts installed a set of corrective optics called co-star, essentially a set of tiny mirrors that compensated for the flaw in the primary mirror, like a pair of glasses for a telescope. When Hubble reopened its corrected eye and looked outward again, the images that came back were stunning, sharp, clear, and more beautiful than anyone had dared to hope. It was one of the most remarkable repair jobs in history, a flaw smaller than a hair, fixed by human hands, floating in space 200 miles above the Earth. On Christmas Day 2021, a rocket lifted off from a launch site in French Guiana and carried into the sky the most powerful and most ambitious space telescope ever built, the James Webb Space Telescope. Named after James E. Webb, who led NASA during the formative Apollo era, the telescope had been in development for more than 2 decades, the product of the combined efforts of NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency. It was designed to see what Hubble could not, to look deeper into the universe, further back in time and with greater sensitivity than any instrument before it. Its primary mirror is 6.5 meters across, nearly 3 times the diameter of Hubble's, giving it roughly 6 times the light collecting area. And it observes primarily in infrared light, which allows it to see through clouds of cosmic dust that block visible light and to capture the faint red-shifted glow of the very first galaxies that formed after the Big Bang. The telescope was too large to fit inside the rocket fully assembled, so it was designed to unfold in space, a complex, nerve-wracking sequence of deployments involving a sunshield the size of a tennis court and 18 hexagonal mirror segments that had to align themselves with nanometer precision. It worked. Every step, every fold, every latch. And when the first images arrived, they were beyond anything the world had imagined. The James Webb Space Telescope does not orbit the Earth the way Hubble does. Instead, it orbits the Sun at a very special location known as the Second Lagrange Point, or L2, approximately 1.5 million kilometers from Earth, about 4 times farther away than the Moon. L2 is a gravitational sweet spot, a place where the combined gravitational pull of the Earth and the Sun, together with the orbital motion of the telescope, conspire to keep it in a stable position relative to our planet, always on the side of the Earth that faces away from the Sun. This is important because Webb observes in infrared light, essentially heat radiation, and to detect the faintest, most distant signals from the early universe, it needs to be extraordinarily cold. Its instruments operate at temperatures as low as -233 degrees Celsius, just 40 degrees above absolute zero, the coldest temperature possible in the universe. At L2, the telescope can keep its sun shield permanently pointed at the Sun, Earth, and Moon, blocking their heat and light, while its mirrors and instruments face outward into the cold, dark depths of space. It is a lonely outpost, far from any possibility of human repair or servicing, and yet from that distant, frigid perch, it is showing us the universe in ways we have never seen it before. The James Webb Space Telescope's primary mirror is a magnificent piece of engineering measuring 6.5 meters, over 21 feet, a cross composed of 18 individual hexagonal segments arranged in a honeycomb pattern. Each segment is made of beryllium, a light and strong metal that holds its shape exceptionally well in extreme cold, and each one is coated in a microscopically thin layer of gold, just 100 nanometers thick, about 1,000 times thinner than a human hair. Gold was chosen not for its beauty, though it is beautiful, but for its extraordinary ability to reflect infrared light, the wavelengths that Webb is designed to capture. The 18 segments work together as a single mirror, and after deployment in space, each one was adjusted by tiny motors with a precision of 10 nanometers, roughly the width of a few atoms, until the entire array was aligned to form a perfect, unified surface. It is a mirror unlike any ever made, a golden eye assembled in the cold of space, composed of 18 petals that opened and aligned themselves with atomic precision, all to catch the faintest whisper of light from galaxies that formed when the universe was only a few 100 million years old. Unlike Hubble, which observes primarily in visible and ultraviolet light, the same wavelengths that human eyes can see, the James Webb Space Telescope observes primarily in infrared light, which is invisible to us but profoundly important for understanding the cosmos. Infrared light has longer wavelengths than visible light, and this gives Webb two extraordinary abilities. First, it can see through clouds of cosmic dust, many of the most interesting regions of the universe, the places where stars are being born, the centers of galaxies, the disks around young planets, are hidden behind thick veils of dust that block visible light completely. Infrared light passes through this dust the way radio waves pass through walls, revealing what lies hidden on the other side. Second, Webb can see the most distant objects in the universe. Because the universe is expanding, the light from the earliest galaxies has been stretched as it traveled, shifted from visible wavelengths into the infrared, a phenomenon called redshift. By observing in the infrared, Webb can capture this ancient, stretched light and reconstruct what those first galaxies looked like, what they were made of, and how they began to form in the young, still cooling universe. It is, in a very real sense, a time machine, an instrument that lets us look backward through billions of years, past veil after veil of dust and distance, and glimpse the universe as it was when it was just beginning to light its first candles. Not all of the important light in the universe can be seen or felt as warmth. Some of the most energetic and violent events in the cosmos reveal themselves in X-rays, high-energy radiation produced by superheated gas swirling around black holes, by the remnants of exploded stars, by matter heated to millions of degrees in the collisions between galaxy clusters. To study this fierce, invisible light, NASA launched the Chandra X-ray Observatory in 1999, deploying it into a high orbit that carries it more than a third of the way to the Moon. Chandra observes the universe in X-rays, revealing a hidden landscape of extreme physics that is invisible in ordinary light. It has studied the jets of energy shooting from supermassive black holes, the expanding shells of gas left behind by supernovae, the hot, diffuse gas that fills the space between galaxies in enormous clusters, and the behavior of matter under conditions of temperature and pressure that cannot be replicated anywhere on Earth. Chandra shows us the violent side of the universe, the places where gravity crushes, where temperatures soar, where matter is torn apart and reassembled. And in doing so, it reminds us that the cosmos is not only vast and gentle, but also fierce, dynamic, and alive with energies that would be terrifying if they were not also, in their own way, breathtakingly beautiful. The Kepler Space Telescope, which operated from 2009 to 2018, was designed with a single, focused purpose: to discover planets orbiting other stars. It did this by staring with extraordinary patience at a single patch of sky in the constellation Cygnus, monitoring the brightness of more than 150,000 stars simultaneously, watching for the tiny, periodic dips in light that occur when a planet passes in front of its star, a phenomenon called a transit. Each dip was minuscule, a dimming of perhaps 1/100th of 1%, but Kepler's instruments were sensitive enough to detect them, and over the course of its 9-year mission, it discovered more than 2,600 confirmed exoplanets. Some were gas giants larger than Jupiter, orbiting so close to their stars that their surfaces were molten. Others were small and rocky, not so different in size from Earth, orbiting in the habitable zone. the region around a star where temperatures might allow liquid water to exist on the surface. Kepler revealed that planets are not rare, they are everywhere. Nearly every star in the sky has at least one planet, and many have several. The galaxy is teeming with worlds, billions and billions of them, and Kepler was the telescope that showed us this astonishing abundance. A quiet, patient eye that stared at one small corner of the sky and found that it was full of worlds we had never known were there. In 2018, NASA launched the Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite, known as TESS, to continue and expand the work that Kepler had begun. While Kepler focused on a single distant patch of sky, TESS was designed to survey nearly the entire sky, monitoring the closest and brightest stars for the telltale dimming caused by orbiting planets. Its cameras scan broad swathes of the heavens sector by sector, building a comprehensive catalogue of nearby worlds that future telescopes, including Webb, can study in greater detail. TESS has already discovered thousands of exoplanet candidates, and hundreds have been confirmed as real worlds, including rocky planets in the habitable zones of their stars, planets with atmospheres that might one day be analysed for signs of life. TESS is, in a sense, a map maker, charting the nearest planetary systems, identifying the most promising targets, creating a guide for the generation of telescopes and missions that will follow. It does its work quietly, scanning the sky night after night, its instruments recording the faintest flickers of starlight, searching for the shadows of worlds we cannot yet see but that we know, thanks to Kepler, must be there, waiting in the dark, orbiting their quiet suns, unknown and unvisited but no longer unimaginable. In the mid-2000s, a company called SpaceX achieved something that had never been done before. It landed an orbital-class rocket booster back on Earth after launching a payload into space. The Falcon 9 rocket, designed by SpaceX, lifts off on a column of 9 Merlin engines, carries its payload toward orbit, and then, after the upper stage separates and continues on its way, the first stage turns around, reignites its engines, guides itself back through the atmosphere, and lands vertically on a concrete pad or a floating drone ship in the ocean. The first successful landing occurred in December of 2015, and the first reflight of a recovered booster took place in March of 2017. It was a sight that seemed to defy intuition. A rocket, tall and slender, descending tail first through the sky on a pillar of flame, slowing gently, extending its landing legs and touching down with a precision that bordered on grace. The significance was enormous. By recovering and reusing the most expensive part of the rocket, SpaceX dramatically reduced the cost of reaching orbit, opening the door to a future in which spaceflight could become more frequent, more accessible, and more routine. In May of 2020, a SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, carrying NASA astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken to the International Space Station. It was the first time in nearly a decade that American astronauts had launched to orbit from American soil. Since the retirement of the Space Shuttle in 2011, NASA had been relying on Russian Soyuz spacecraft to ferry its crews to and from the ISS. The Crew Dragon capsule, sleek and modern, with touchscreen controls and a minimalist interior, represented a new model for human spaceflight, a commercially built and operated vehicle developed under contract with NASA but owned by a private company. The mission, called Demo 2, proved that commercial spacecraft could safely carry humans to orbit, and it marked the beginning of regular crewed flights aboard Crew Dragon, restoring the United States' ability to launch its own astronauts independently. It was a milestone not just of technology but of philosophy, a demonstration that the partnership between government space agencies and private companies could work, that the future of human spaceflight need not rest on the shoulders of any single nation alone, but could be shared and carried forward by many hands reaching upward together. In November of 2022, NASA launched the Artemis 1 mission, an uncrewed test flight that sent the Orion spacecraft on a journey around the Moon and back, the first step in NASA's plan to return humans to the lunar surface for the first time since 1972. The Orion capsule, sitting atop the massive Space Launch System rocket, the most powerful rocket NASA has ever built, lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center, traveled to the Moon, entered a distant retrograde orbit that carried it farther from Earth than any spacecraft designed for human occupancy had ever traveled, and then returned safely, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean after a mission lasting 25.5 days. The heat shield endured temperatures of nearly 2,800 degrees Celsius during re-entry, hotter than the surface of Venus, and performed flawlessly. Artemis 1 carried no crew, but it carried a promise. It was the first act in a new chapter of lunar exploration, a declaration that the Moon, which has been waiting in the silence since Eugene Cernan climbed back into his lunar module in 1972, will not have to wait much longer. NASA's Artemis program is not simply a return to the Moon, it is an intentional reimagining of who gets to go. The program has stated as a core goal that it aims to land the first woman and the first person of color on the lunar surface. This is not an incidental detail. It is a deliberate and meaningful expansion of the story, an acknowledgement that the 12 people who walked on the Moon during Apollo, all white American men, represented only a small fraction of the humanity that dreamed of going. The Artemis program envisions a future in which the surface of the Moon bears footprints of greater diversity, in which the images sent back to Earth show faces that more fully reflect the species making the journey. Because when a young girl looks at the Moon and knows that someone who looks like her has walked there, or when a young person of color sees themselves reflected in the visor of an astronaut standing on another world, the sky opens a little wider. The invitation becomes a little more real. The future becomes a little more like home. On January 3, 2019, a Chinese spacecraft called Chang'e 4 touched down on the far side of the Moon, the hemisphere that always faces away from Earth, hidden from our view, and in doing so, achieved something no nation or space agency had ever accomplished before. The far side of the Moon is a challenging destination because it is permanently out of direct radio contact with Earth. To communicate with Chang'e 4, China first had to launch a relay satellite, Queqiao, into orbit at the L2 point beyond the Moon, where it could serve as a bridge for signals between the lander and mission control. Chang'e 4 landed in the von Karman crater within the vast South Pole Aitken Basin, one of the oldest and deepest impact craters in the solar system. It carried a small rover called Yutu-2, which has been exploring the surface, analyzing the composition of the soil, and studying the subsurface structure with ground-penetrating radar. The mission also carried a small sealed biosphere that successfully germinated cotton seeds on the lunar surface, the first biological experiment of its kind on the Moon. Chang'e 4 was a quiet but profound achievement, a demonstration that China had become a major spacefaring power capable of reaching destinations that no one else had reached. In December of 2020, China's Chang'e 5 mission accomplished something that had not been done in over 4 decades. It collected samples of lunar rock and soil from the Moon's surface and returned them safely to Earth. The last time anyone had brought back pieces of the Moon was in 1976, when the Soviet Union's Luna 24 probe returned a small cache of lunar material. Chang'e 5 landed in a region called Oceanus Procellarum, the Ocean of Storms, and used a drill and a robotic scoop to collect approximately 1.73 kilograms of material from the surface and from a depth of about 2 meters below. The samples were sealed in a capsule launched from the lunar surface by a small ascent vehicle, transferred to an orbiting module, and then carried back to Earth, where the return capsule parachuted down in Inner Mongolia. The samples themselves proved to be scientifically valuable. They were found to be about 2 billion years old, significantly younger than the Apollo samples, providing new evidence that volcanic activity on the Moon continued far longer than previously thought. A handful of moonlight gathered by a machine returned across the void and whispering a new chapter of the Moon's long, quiet story. On August 23, 2023, India achieved a milestone that placed it among the most elite ranks of spacefaring nations. Its Chandrayaan-3 mission successfully landed a spacecraft near the Moon's south pole, making India the 4th country in history to achieve a soft landing on the lunar surface after the Soviet Union, the United States, and China. The lander, named Vikram, touched down in a region of particular scientific interest because it is near the permanently shadowed craters at the Moon's south pole, where scientists believe deposits of water ice may be trapped, water that could one day be used to sustain human explorers or be converted into rocket fuel. The lander carried a small rover called Pragyan, which rolled out onto the surface and analyzed the composition of the lunar soil. The mission was a triumph for the Indian Space Research Organization, which had come agonizingly close 4 years earlier when Chandrayaan-2's lander had crashed during descent. The successful landing was celebrated across India and around the world. a reminder that the dream of reaching beyond our atmosphere belongs to all of humanity. On January 19, 2024, Japan became the 5th country to achieve a soft landing on the Moon when its SLIM spacecraft, an acronym for Smart Lander for Investigating Moon, touched down on the lunar surface. SLIM was a technology demonstration mission designed to test precision landing techniques that could guide a spacecraft to within 100 meters of a specific target on the Moon's surface. The spacecraft largely succeeded in this goal, landing very close to its target site in Scioli crater near the equator, though it came to rest in an inverted orientation with its solar panels facing away from the Sun, which limited its ability to generate power. Despite this, SLIM managed to operate and transmit data before its batteries faded, and when sunlight eventually reached its panels as the lunar day progressed, it briefly came back to life. Japan's arrival on the Moon added a new flag to the quiet, growing collection of nations that have placed machines on the lunar surface. The Moon's guest book is growing, one gentle landing at a time. One of the most ambitious missions in the current era of space exploration is the Mars Sample Return Campaign, a joint effort between NASA and the European Space Agency that aims to bring the rock and soil samples collected by the Perseverance rover back to Earth. Perseverance has been carefully selecting, drilling and sealing samples of Martian rock into small titanium-cased tubes, and a future mission would send a lander to Mars, deploy a small rocket from the Martian surface, the first rocket ever launched from another planet, to carry the samples into orbit, where a European-built spacecraft would capture them and carry them back to Earth. The technical challenges are immense, and the mission's design and timeline have undergone revisions and debates about cost and feasibility. But the scientific reward would be extraordinary. Actual pieces of Mars analyzed in laboratories on Earth with instruments far more sophisticated than anything a rover could carry. These samples could reveal whether Mars ever harbored life, answer questions about the planet's geological and climatic history, and help prepare for the eventual day when human explorers set foot on Martian soil. In October of 2024, NASA launched the Europa Clipper mission, a spacecraft designed to study one of the most tantalizing destinations in our solar system. Europa, the ice-covered moon of Jupiter believed to harbor a vast ocean of liquid water beneath its frozen shell. Europa Clipper will not land on the moon's surface. Instead, it will orbit Jupiter and make dozens of close flybys of Europa, sweeping past the moon again and again, each time using a suite of 9 scientific instruments to study the ice shell's thickness and composition, map the surface in high resolution, analyze the faint atmosphere, measure the magnetic field, and search for plumes of water vapor erupting from cracks in the ice. The mission is designed to determine whether Europa possesses the conditions necessary for life: liquid water, the right chemical ingredients, and a source of energy. Somewhere beneath the ice of Europa, in an ocean that has never seen sunlight, warmed by the tidal flexing of Jupiter's gravity, there may be something alive, and Europa Clipper is going to find out if the conditions are right for that possibility to exist. SpaceX is developing Starship, a fully reusable launch system designed to be the most powerful rocket ever built and the vehicle that could carry human beings to the Moon, to Mars, and beyond. The system consists of 2 stages: the Super Heavy booster, powered by 33 Raptor engines, and the Starship upper stage, which serves as both the spacecraft and the second stage. Both are designed to be fully reusable. The booster by returning to the launch site and being caught by mechanical arms on the launch tower, and the Starship by re-entering the atmosphere using its body as a heat shield and landing vertically. When fully operational, Starship is intended to carry up to 100 metric tons to low Earth orbit and potentially to the surface of the Moon or Mars at a cost far lower than any existing launch system. It is an audacious vision, a rocket the size of a skyscraper designed to be flown again and again like an airplane, opening the solar system to human exploration in a way that has never been economically feasible before. Whether Starship achieves all of its promises remains to be seen, but the ambition itself, the sheer, stubborn, starward reach of it, is a continuation of the oldest impulse in this story: the desire to go, to see, to be somewhere we have never been. As of 2024, more than 600 people from over 40 countries have traveled to space since Yuri Gagarin made his solitary orbit in 1961. 600 human beings who have felt the shaking violence of launch, The sudden hush of orbit, the strange and tender sensation of weightlessness, and the overwhelming beauty of seeing the Earth from above. They have been men and women, military pilots and civilian scientists, people from nations large and small, from every inhabited continent. They have spoken dozens of languages, prayed to different gods or to none at all, and carried with them the hopes and dreams and tax dollars and good wishes of billions of people who stayed on the ground and watched them go. 600 people. It is a small number set against the 8 billion souls who share this planet, but it is growing. Every year, more people cross the Kármán line. Every year, the circle widens, the door opens a little wider, and the sky becomes a place that belongs not to a select few, but to more and more of us. 600 travelers from more than 40 countries have seen the Earth as a single, fragile, luminous whole, without borders, without divisions, without any of the lines we draw on maps. And every one of them, in their own way, has come back changed. Not because space gives you something new, but because it shows you what was always there. The beauty, the fragility, and the breathtaking togetherness of the world you came from. And so we come to the end of our walk, gentle traveller. 101 true things, 101 small lanterns lit along the path, each one a piece of the extraordinary story of how we reached beyond our world and into the dark. You do not need to remember any of them. They will be here whenever you want to return. But for now, let them fade. Let them dissolve like starlight into the soft edges of sleep. You are safe. You are warm. The universe is vast and old and patient, and it will still be there in the morning, waiting for you, turning its slow and beautiful circles, carrying all of us, every person, every city, every ocean, every sleeping child, gently through the dark. Rest now. Let your breath go soft. Let your eyes close. The stars will keep watch tonight. Good night, gentle traveller. Good night.